This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Hello, and welcome back to the show. I have an interesting guest. And essentially what we're going to talk about today is monism. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi. First, thank you for bringing me on the show. My name is Adam, but most people may recognize my username Tweetophon on Twitter. I'm on a couple other sites as well, like the RPG Codex. But mostly, I think you noticed me perhaps on Twitter, where I'm usually arguing with people about all sorts of philosophical views and monism.
Yeah, I did. I came across you on Twitter. I feel like arguing with people on Twitter. It's like the ancient Greek forums, but objectively worse, right?
Well,
Anyways,
it is. It is. I think that's why I love it, because it's sort of now, thanks to the internet, you can run into people with all these sort of viewpoints that you'd never have bumped into them without the internet, right?
oh yeah, I've talked to some people who like I'll look at their Twitter bio, and I've been immersed in this stuff for a while. Like I have been solidly in the esoteric hole for a few years, and they'll sometimes have like isms that I've never heard of, and I'm like, you know what? Good for you. Good for you. Anyways, just to start off, I'd like to ask the most basic, boring question possible, but the most important one, I would say, considering our subject matter. What exactly is monism?
uh, I think the most important question is always the least clear, right? It's You're going to get so many different answers depending on who you ask, which is kind of funny. In monism, it's supposed to be one thing, right? But the if you go and you start looking into monism, you'll find all sorts of different positions on it, like substance monism and whatnot. For me, all I'm going to be able to really talk about is my interpretation of certain authors, pre-Socratic philosophers. And so it's a particular sort of brand of monism. I think it's correct. That's why I read it and argue about it and try to promote it or get people interested in it. Most people also heard of it. I think in high school, most people encounter Zeno and Parmenides. Maybe they're in math class or something, or geometry, and the guy says, "Look, you can divide a line in half, and then you can divide it in another half, and again and again." These are all sort of problems we kind of get interested in thanks to Zeno. But for me, monism, coming from these authors, is really that metaphysically everything is. There is what is, and it's all one unified thing or reality. So it's all one. There's no real ability to separate things and not have them be connected in any way. It simply all is, and everything you can speak about is. And if there were to be something that is not, I mean, that's already a contradiction, but you wouldn't be talking about it, would you? It wouldn't be. So what would you be pointing at, or what would you be referencing?
Yeah, I think when I had heard the term a bit, but I remember coming across it in a deeper sense when I was looking into like the metaphysical side of things, right? Because I came into all of this through this kind of like esoteric, occult type way. And when I got deeper into metaphysics, I started seeing that, I mean, a lot of these paradigms, because at the time I was really looking at the Western stuff, they all sort of came back to this idea of there is no separation. There is this diagram. I see it everywhere where it's this circle with a little dot in the center of it. Seems like everything comes back to this little diagram. And seems to be like what a lot of systems reduce to at the end, which I always found quite interesting because I at first would assume there is some sort of, I guess, contradiction between, especially if someone's like into like polytheism and this monism idea. But honestly, most stuff I look at tends to kind of reduce to it when you get deep enough into the sort of weeds of it.
Right. I think you've had a number of guests that are Platonists, and Plato himself has a certain sort of reverence for Parmenides. And Neoplatonists seem to pick up on that, although they have their own interpretations. And even though I would not consider myself in agreement with them, like you said, when they're getting deep into it, they wind up seeing some sort of truth there. They're clearly somewhat attracted and have their interpretation of monism and Parmenides, and want to attach themselves to it in some way. I think to back up a little bit, you mentioned getting into metaphysics and seeing this theme, and also the diagram of a circle. Some people would say that Parmenides is kind of the father of metaphysics, or at least a father of Western metaphysics or Greek metaphysics. And if you read his poem where he receives a revelation from a goddess, he actually says being is like a well-shaped sphere, right? Because every point on the sphere is equally distant from the center. I mean, whichever direction you go in. But it's not to say that it is a sphere, but even with Parmenides, you can kind of get that diagram from him. He doesn't say literally being is a sphere, although some people may argue that that was his position. But you even with the very beginning, you get that diagram of a circle with a point in it.
Yeah, and it just a lot of stuff tends to come back to it. Um, so do you think that monism is kind of what I wanted to ask you is monism, it seems like an endpoint in a lot of these systems. So do you think it can exist in multiple metaphysical frameworks, or do you think it kind of belongs to certain specific ones?
I think that there's only, well, it doesn't belong in multiple different systems. I think there's just one truth or way to express it. What I think is an issue is that people may develop, if we have a hierarchy of philosophy, for example, like what's the broadest context for everything you're about to say, and what are some more narrow subjects? Maybe they look at some more narrow subjects. Maybe someone gets into philosophy by reading some ethical dialogues from Plato, or maybe they read the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, or they start somewhere where it's like a more a more narrow subject, human ethics, let's say, and then of course they develop their philosophy and read more, and then they realize that this very broad point about monism, they may also feel that's true. But I don't think it's wise to have that as your end point, because if you see the truth of that broader position, then you have to acknowledge that everything else you believe is within that context and has to comply with that context. So I think that you, upon realizing that broader truth, that has to be a real start point for you, where you then go over everything that you believe or know and see if it complies with the whole. So to see whether or not you've been positing that there is and is not, or that there is something beyond being, or these other misteachings. Because if you like I did when I was younger, if you really got into some of these authors and believed much of what they said, and then you also on the side thought, yes, Parmenides, Melissus, these other Eleatic monists, they were right, you're going to have a situation where if you try and push them together, there's going to be, I believe, some real contradictions and problems. And so I don't think you can take monism as an endpoint necessarily. It has to inform everything you say. It's like if you have a system of geometry, or you have a programming language, or you have anything, it sort of gives you a framework. And then what you put inside it, like if you have geometry and it's a system of points and you can draw lines between them, you can't then draw like a curved line. I mean, how would you do that with just 2 points and a line between them? You have to operate within the system. Otherwise, if you're going to break the system and do something beyond it, it becomes a contradiction. And so I fear that if you adopted a lot of positions, studied a lot of philosophy, and then later came to monism as a broader context, well, then you better go back and make sure that all of your other beliefs comply with that broader framework rather than fall in contradiction with it. And that's usually why I wind up disagreeing with a lot of people, because I think that even if they like the Eleatics to some extent, something that they believe contradicts that broader point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I see a lot of people who basically are in a position where they're essentially, I guess, discovering truth or whatever, they're on their path, and they do develop deeply contradictory metaphysical positions. And I think part of it is that people, or at least this is one of my theories, people get very attached to the spiritual labels and terminology that they learned earlier on. And so when they discover some new thing that makes more sense to them or is more true, they don't want to unlatch to what they already had. And so they accept these contradictions instead of being willing to release what they already understood in favor of the new thing. It's sort of like a spiritual sunk cost fallacy almost.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I made the, I don't know if it's a mistake because it's, people grow and that's sort of one of the stages of development of thought, I guess. But I was in the same situation. I got really attached to certain metaphysical or philosophical views, and then it just reached a point where I realized I, I can't sort of square this circle. Like there's a contradiction that needs to be resolved, and I wound up resolving it in one way and siding with a certain school of philosophy and rejecting some others that I previously had agreed with and now no longer could. Um, so it's just, I think it's just, you don't start out a journey with absolute knowledge of all things. So as you gather it and accumulate it, and you find people informative, you get attached to them, like you said, and unfortunately, you may find that you start accumulating all these contradictions.
Yeah, and I think contradictions, people work through them in either one of two ways I've noticed, right? You either get people who have, like, they just ignore the contradictions and they develop this really contradictory framework. I remember I talked forever ago with this guy who was very frustrated that people within his religious paradigm have developed these really, basically, like, they were so individualistic in their thinking within this paradigm that they were no longer within the paradigm at all, but still claiming to it, and he was getting very frustrated. And then I see the other side, which is where people just kind of have this, like, I don't know, this kind of existential crisis when they realize that perhaps they were previously in a state of what they now perceive as wrong. And it's just, it creates a lot of complexities. I think that as people, we need to realize that it is a journey and that sometimes we might think that our past selves were wrong about things and not, I don't know, lose our heads about it. But back to the subject, I know I've had a number of Platonists on my show, and you mentioned that and your kind of disagreements with Platonism. And I know, like, when you look into monism and people who write about it, they like there seems to be a bit of an overlap with the Platonist crowd. What is that relationship like? Um,
Well, you have to, I guess, go back a little historically. So, when did Hellenic philosophy begin, or where did it begin? It doesn't begin in what we would call the modern nation of Greece, like where that's located. It started out in the colonies, with thinkers that we would call pre-Socratics, right? So Parmenides is out west. So Zeno is with Parmenides. So he's out west in Italy, well, what we would call Italy today, or what was then Greater Greece. And Melissus, the other big Eleatic thinker, he's out east. Um, so philosophy really comes later to Athens. And of course, that's where you have sophists like Plato in Athens. And so you can't really escape the pre Socratics because that's sort of the generation, two generations or more prior to Plato. Prior to Plato, there have been multiple generations of people discussing philosophy, and he kind of has to deal with that. And Plato's not the only show in town. Obviously, there's a lot of thinkers in Athens at that time. Um, and they do add some things to philosophy. I mean, by the time philosophy gets to Athens, they bring in a lot of ethical and political thought. But I think you kind of have to accept that Plato is invariably going to be discussing pre-Socratics and Parmenides because those in his time were the historical big players. It's like anyone on Twitter today saying Hegel said this, Nietzsche said that. I don't read any Germans really, but they're big today, right? And they were alive, a couple of centuries ago. And so just like for Plato, who was alive a century or two ago, well, there you go, the pre Socratics, from Thales down to some contemporaries of Plato.
What are some specific ideas from these pre-Socratic thinkers that you find interesting and relevant to monism?
Well, to monism specifically, I mean, pre-Socratics, to anyone listening, I would suggest definitely, if you haven't heard about them, go read up on them. They're very exciting people. It's sort of the birth of philosophy, and there's so many different ideas out there about all sorts of things, and they're just freely theorizing and competing with each other and having debates everywhere. And they come up with some wild ideas that are maybe not relevant today necessarily. Like maybe we wouldn't adopt them, but they're still very interesting and at times very, very funny. Um, so it's a wild time for philosophy, just any sort of idea, people just spitballing all sorts of things. Um, where do the monists come in? Where do the Eleatics come in? So with Parmenides, he kind of, for me, what's inspiring about him is he's highlighting what the broadest context is that we can talk about. Like, what's the, when I say a context, like, what's the largest worldview, or what's the most all encompassing worldview that we can discuss? Because we want to, like, what are we even doing with philosophy other than trying to understand the world around us and come to some sort of sense of meaning and purpose and everything? So he's like, let's talk about what is what's absolutely everything we can discuss. Like, what is the most important thing? What's the greatest thing? What's most of all? And so it just becomes a question of, well, everything we talk about has some sort of presence or being. It exists. It has some sort of meaning. And so whatever we talk about, it exists. It has an independent or a sort of meaning to it. It's not a nothing. So he receives a revelation, of course, in the poem. And so for me, it's inspiring because he broadened that perspective. When you read Parmenides, your perspective goes out to all of being, just everything as a whole. It's like literally everything that could be spoken of, everything that is. There's nothing beyond it. And that point about nothing beyond it is something that I think Platonists and others find disagreeable. But to me, I agree with it. And I just think, wow, this is inspiring. No longer am I talking about, is everything made of fire or is everything made of air? Now I'm talking about what is what is everything, like what is the most broad worldview we can have that encompasses all that we might know. And this framework starts with, it all is, it all has meaning, because if it didn't have meaning we wouldn't be talking about it, because there would be nothing to distinguish or to highlight or to point at. um, and so moving on from there, you find there are all sorts of ramifications, because if everything is, then how can there be the sort of change that other people want to discuss? Like, let's say you have, a cup of tea on your desk right now, and you finish drinking it. Well, what happened to the cup of tea that was on your desk? Is it like, did you destroy it into nothing? Well, you can't have, because what is not, and what is, and what is cannot be what is not, and what is not cannot be what is. And so the tea still has to be there, just as it was in some sense. And change itself becomes a difficult puzzle that you either outright deny, or you have to at least heavily rework and deny a lot of the assumptions of other people. Because, for example, Melissus, the Eleatic from out east, he's saying in a line that even the arrangement of things has meaning. So, like a ball in my left hand and a ball in my right hand, these are two different arrangements. Like in one arrangement, it's in my left hand, in the other arrangement, it's over in my right. And so, how can the ball in my left hand become the ball in my right hand? Because where is that extra information coming? Where is that distinction coming from? They both have to exist permanently and always be there. And so there's sort of this affirmation that everything is and always has been, and there's no alternative to existence. And so it really just radically, it's just a radical worldview that requires you to adjust, or at least to revise or carefully consider everything else you say about the world.
Yeah, this makes me wonder, does this kind of lead to an implication? And this is a sort of, I guess, take that I believe, but I don't know how much this would square with monism, that within everything there is some sort of divinity, and there is sort of divinity emanating outwards and through everything. Is that an implication that comes from this?
No, I don't think so. So on the point of divinity, we're just okay for purposes of let's just say there's three main Eleatics, which there really are, that have been passed down to us: Parmenides, Zeno, and Melissus. And what do they say about divinity? So for Parmenides, the only that there are gods mentioned, but they're not being. Metaphysics is, at least in my interpretation, broader than theology. So for Parmenides, he's taken to visit a goddess, and a goddess reveals to him certain metaphysical points, namely that what is, and that's what we talk about because it has content or meaning, and what is not, and we don't talk about it because it has no content and we couldn't point to it or mention it. But the goddess, I find this revelation, if it's not just for poetry's sake, but I find this revelation particularly interesting because the goddess is not giving herself a metaphysical importance or role. She's revealing truth to him, but it's not to say that she is being or that she is this great, thing beyond being. She just simply has this knowledge and has agreed to impart it to Melissus and later tell Melissus why other people are confused. Why she favors him, I don't recall, or maybe it's not even mentioned in there, but she wants him to A, she grants him the truth, and B, prepares him to argue it with other people. For Zeno, he's not as well preserved, but the gods just don't feature. And Zeno's project, as far as we know, really isn't to talk about the gods. What Zeno's project, as far as we can tell, at least if we believe Plato, who's not exactly trustworthy, but let's say we believe Plato, he's writing a series of sort of paradoxes or puzzles in order to attack people that say that there are many independent things and that change occurs. Um, so he's attacking certain other schools. And by attacking other schools, he's strengthening Parmenides' reputation in case and making Parmenides seem less ridiculous. So already those two, neither one of them have equated being with the divine or with a god. And then we go to Melissus, who is, I suppose, the third main one that we have. And he doesn't mention the gods at all. Um, he's preserved not as many lines as Parmenides, but still, well, it's pretty close. I mean, there's some very long form fragments from Melissus, perhaps enough to reconstruct an entire pamphlet of his work. And he doesn't mention the gods at all. And at one point, he says, being doesn't suffer pain; it doesn't get upset. So my reading of him is he's quite secular. He's saying being is not sentient, and to me, that makes a lot of sense because being is no more one thing than another. If it is everything, if it is isness or everything that is, then being is no more me than it is you. I mean, we both exist absolutely to an equal degree. So there's no ability to say that, you know, if God was being, then I would be part of God, basically. And also, God would no longer, there'd be no privileged part of God. Like his thoughts wouldn't be any more privileged than my thoughts in terms of their mere existence because everything exists absolutely and without alternative. So I definitely would not read divinity into the ontology, the being. But I'm happy to have gods and goddesses and other all sorts of entities within that context, but they're all limited, which therefore you can understand why perhaps I fall into disagreements with Christians and others because I would say I could believe in Jesus and I could say that he's a god or some sort of powerful entity. I don't have a dog in that fight, but I could believe it. But you'd have to tone down the claims a lot. You couldn't tell me that Jesus is God and God is the source of all being and God could destroy being to nothing, like, or he can create from nothing, because those sorts of things I just don't. I don't see any privileged point for God in terms of just a mere fact of existence, because everything exists absolutely without alternative. because there is no alternative but to exist.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. Would you consider then monism as like a religious identifier for yourself? Like, would you say you belong to any particular religion, or do you just say I'm a monist?
Yeah, I don't have many people ask me, do I belong to a religion? Um, I wouldn't. I wouldn't like introduce myself as belonging to a particular religion or church. No, but at the same time, I don't want to be termed an atheist because that comes with its own set of connotations. I'm sort of ambivalent on the question of gods. I don't want to offend them if they do exist, and I'm not saying they do or don't, but I believe that metaphysics is broader and more certain than theology. And so if a god told me that he was responsible for being or something, I couldn't go with that religion, and I wouldn't believe any sort of entity that told me that without some sort of further reasoning. But in terms of what I would tell people, I guess I would tell them I'm monist. I'd probably tell them I believe that metaphysics is greater than religion, and I believe in Parmenides, the teachings of Parmenides and Zeno and Melissus and others. But at the same time, I do believe in a kind of a natural law. I do believe in morality. I'm not thinking that people should go do whatever they want to do.
Yeah, that's interesting because I do feel like people really put theology, religion, and metaphysics kind of in one category a lot of the time. I mean, not everyone does, but I feel like often we put that together and we link it in a way that, I mean, if you really think about it, it doesn't necessarily need to be as tightly linked as we do tend to make it.
Well, yeah, I mean, for example, let's take a common argument that you might encounter. You might encounter a teaching that says, I don't know, God created from nothing. But if your metaphysics doesn't have a category termed nothing, it just has a category termed being, and literally everything that could be mentioned is in the context of being, then there's really no place for that theological teaching, right? The metaphysics lays the framework for that theology, and that theology, it's either going to have to comply with that metaphysical framework, or it's going to be in contradiction, and you need to either change the theology or change the metaphysics. And I believe the metaphysics is the only thing that is certain, whereas the theological teaching about that particular theological teaching is not certain. It's a claim, and I think it's incoherent and meaningless ultimately.
Yeah, that's interesting because for a specific example, I remember the Abrahamic faith, right? It's what we're exposed to the most in the West, right? And it's all about that being from nothing. And I found Kabbalah, which exists in kind of all the Abrahamic frameworks in its own way, and it got into explaining this and saying that there's three veils of non-existence and nothingness. And I started looking deeper at this, and there were things that I found that contradicted with the exoteric teachings of the Abrahamic faiths. And I saw that a number of leaders in those faiths actually said, no, this Kabbalah stuff that explains this nothingness and this chain of creation, this lightning strike, is essentially, since it divides divinity up into spheres. For you don't know, for basics, there's three veils of nothing, and then there's 10 spheres that things are divided down, right? This is the explanation. And then people were like, oh, that's really contradictory. And I looked deeper and I was like, yeah, this actually is. In a sense, this chain of being, division, understanding, it's not really monotheistic when you look hard enough at it. And so I think there is a lot of that, right? Like the metaphysics and theology of religions will have contradictions within them that create questions. It's a reason why I would say I don't know, I guess I use vague terms for myself, like perennialist, because I'm more interested in that inner mystic truth than what the exoteric teachings of things are, right? I want truth and divinity on itself, right? More less than like the outward facing part of religion. I'm much less interested in that. And I think you're right. I think there are a lot of these times where when you get into these deeper explanations, they go into, in the mainstream religion's view, into like heresy territory, if not completely outside of it.
Right, right. If I were to convert to an Abrahamic faith, I would immediately be dubbed a heretic. Yes.
Oh yeah, I'm like a heretic of every religion at this point. I'm kind of just doing my own thing at this point. I like everything, like the deeper I look into all this stuff, I think a lot of it does come to this core inner mystic truth that seems to have been existing But I think no religion's quite got it fully understood yet. That's kind of where I'm at with things. And it's just it's so clear that a lot of these stuff, it all leads back to the same general inner truth, but they extrapolate it so far that they're in contradiction with these mystical experiences. Because fundamentally, what every religion is built upon personal mystical experiences of someone, right? Someone had to have it revealed to them by God or gods, and then everyone extrapolates it out and they build like the legalism, the rules, all that type of stuff. And oftentimes they get so into this legalism that they forget that inner mystic experience that started everything.
Right. I, if we're going to talk about very practical things and how to build out a system and the like, I think one takeaway that I took from the Eleatics, and maybe it's not a popular takeaway from them, is that if everything exists, then whatever you experience is real. It's just a matter of trying to describe or explain it accurately. There should never be a situation where you perceive something or think of something or sense anything and then you say it's not real or it's not. Like, it's all real. It's just a matter of how are we going to describe it, without sort of falling into contradictions or tripping over ourselves. Because once you're a monist and you say everything is, well, then we can't deny the existence of anything we perceive or are aware of, because it all is. And now it just becomes a game of being very careful about how we explain it and fit it all together so that we don't fall into contradictions. Because the presumption being a contradiction would just be incoherent, it would just be gibberish and wouldn't really have any meaning. Um, and so it's almost just like, hey, whatever you're perceiving, just think about what you really did perceive. And then think about the fact that it all has to exist and there's no exception to existing, and see how you can piece it together. And so, like I said, the cup of tea that may have been on your desk at the beginning of the conversation, it's still there at the beginning of the conversation because it can't have gone anywhere else. What is, and there's no other way to be. So if you perceive the cup of tea, half an hour ago, that's where it is, and it is half an hour ago, and you are now talking at a point half an hour distant, and this moment exists as well. But you can't get into a situation where now you deny that half an hour exists. You can't say half an hour ago no longer exists, or the cup of tea no longer exists. It does exist. It may be in a different location than where you are speaking from this location. But you see, hopefully that comes through. It's sort of like a framework for starting the project. It's like, just take note of everything you perceive. Be careful to don't go beyond what the perception was or what your awareness was, and make it into something more than it was. And then be consistent with the framework. Don't start saying things don't exist.
What would you say the biggest misconceptions about monism are?
Well, again, it's I have just a little tiny corner of monism, so I know there's probably a bunch of people online who would say, "Hey, we have this substance monism, or we have this other sort of monism, and we don't agree with you." But the I would say the biggest misconception from my side is that Parmenides and Zeno and everyone are just sort of a meme, and they were all refuted by Aristotle or some other philosopher, and therefore they're just kind of a joke. You don't have to take them too seriously, or that there's a very clear way of interpreting them, and that's the only way to interpret them, and it's kind of a meme where there is no detail to reality, there's no meaning to reality. It's just a meaningless sort of hum of isness with no meaning. So reality is basically non-existent, which again, it can't be non-existent because that would not be a monist system anymore. But also you also get other interpretations that are unusual. Like there's a Neoplatonist called Simplicius, and he interprets Parmenides as a dualist. And I've run into people who take up that interpretation and think that Parmenides felt there was a realm of pure being or being, the truth, the real realm, the path of truth, and then there was a shadow realm of illusions. That's not my interpretation. I don't think it's plausible, but it's not. I mean, it is plausible clearly because a bunch of people believe it, but But I think that's a misconception as well. I think people need to be, again, looking to the broadest context. What is, and that's what we talk about. What is not, and we have nothing to say about it because there would be nothing to talk about. And what is not what is not, and what is not what is. So, kind of carve away. And I just think that I would be very hesitant to treat them as a meme, and I would disagree with anyone who said that they had been somehow refuted by Aristotle or something like that, which is what you hear quite a fair bit. And I think
What
that's all nonsense.
what are the arguments they say refuted by Aristotle? Like, what is their sort of case for it?
Oh, I don't want to pretend to be an Aristotelian, but they got their favorite sayings. They'll say something like "being is said in many ways," and it's, well, I mean, what do you say to that? So yeah, sure, it's said in many ways, but it's also said in one big way. Everything is, I am, you are, these things exist. I mean, they'll say being is said in many ways, and there's no universal placeholder for all of it. But of course, there is a universal placeholder because all of them are being termed being. They're categories of being. But I feel like I'm going to be digging up an argument with people not present. And even though I think they're wrong, I'm sure they'd have their own way of putting it. Other people will say, they'll claim that if you say everything is, you can't have negation. And so we can't say that, you know, Georgina is not Adam or Tweetophon, because how are we going to interpret is not? And then we'll get into, I would say that the answer is that I am saying that Adam is, and I'm saying Georgina is. So actually, is on both sides, and is not should be interpreted as is other than. So when I say Georgina is not Adam, I would be saying Georgina is other than Adam, and in brackets, who also is. So it all is. What are some other ones? They'll say like if A equal so if A equals B and C equals B, then A equals C. And so if A is being and C is being, then A and C should be the same. Of course, you get that. There's a particular Neoplatonist I'm thinking of that was giving me a hard time about that a while back, but now he gives Thomists a hard time, so I always laugh about it. But the I feel that being would be better described as a painting. So A is not really being, and C is not really being. A is, but it's like a detail or an aspect of being. Because if being is like a complete painting, you can pick out the various figures in a painting, right? But the figures in the painting are absolutely subsumed. There's no way to draw them out of the painting. They don't have any existence distinct from the painting. It's just a detail of what is. It all is one great thing. And you can't cut it in half and have two things. You just have one thing and all its details. And we are the details. And all the things that we perceive, they're all the details of this one great isness or being, this one great thing. And just on a historical point, when people discuss the Eleatics and later talk about monism, you'll get people who talk about the one, right? So maybe you'll talk to Neoplatonists or someone who will talk about the one. Um, Parmenides doesn't term it the one. He doesn't use that term. He uses it as an adjective, so it's an adjective. But Melissus terms being the one, so that's also an Eleatic sort of inheritance of theirs, I think.
What are your thoughts on the view of the idea of the monad? Because I feel like people are monism. A lot of people, especially those who listen to me who know a bit about Gnosticism, are like, does this come back to the idea of the monad? Like, what's your thoughts on that concept?
Um, I don't want to say too much without looking it up again because I'm wondering what teaching regarding the monad you're thinking of. The one that comes to my mind immediately is almost a sort of emanation or procession,
Yeah,
because
that's what
yeah,
I was kind of going after. Yeah.
yeah. If you go to Aristotle's Metaphysics, I forget which book. It may even be Book Alpha, but he's critiquing people, and one of his critiques of the Pythagoreans and Plato is that they had these various teachings of numbers and things. And I think what's a line? It's like the monad gives birth to the dyad, and the dyad gives birth to the XYZ. I don't. I'd have to go look it up again, but I don't generally regard that as something I believe in or I'm particularly interested in, because I don't think that the one gives birth to many. I don't think any sort of chronology of creation makes sense, because it all, so there's a fundamental difference in the way we're perceiving the one, or what we mean by the one. When I'm saying the one, I mean what is as a universal statement. It's literally all that is. And if I'm going to say the many, it's just going to be the details or aspects of that one thing, like the images in a painting. It has no separate existence. It wasn't given birth to. It's just a detail of that one thing, that one entity, all that is. And so almost you could say that the one is no particular thing, because it's all things. Whereas when you're talking about that the teachings about the monad, if it's going to be what I just mentioned, they're not understanding the monad as being writ large, or being as this universal category of all things. They're perceiving it as, I almost don't want to speak. I don't think they have a coherent teaching, so I don't really want to say for them what they're thinking, because I don't think they ultimately have a coherent position. But the monad is in some way distinct and separable from the many things, whereas I don't think there is any sort of separation. I think they're wholly subsumed in one thing, and they're just details of it.
Yeah. So does monism lead into if you believe this, you understand this, you internalize this, how does that like affect your life? Like does it give you any specific teachings or ways to live by, or is it just kind of like a state of thing that you acknowledge is what is true?
So there's two ways of looking at it, and one will be actually sort of favorable to these Athenian thinkers, because and later thinkers, because when we talk about the way we live our life, the in day to day, like, am I going to have a cup of tea today? Should I drive my kids to school today? The the Eleatics don't really talk about that. Their focus is on metaphysics and to some extent epistemology and the like. If we're talking about morality and ethics, I do actually find a lot of good in the works of Plato and Aristotle and others. Um, and so I don't want to turn this into a conversation in natural law and the like, but I believe that organisms like people have certain excellences or directions. And, you can kind of tell whether a person is flourishing. I mean, you take a look at them and you see if they got everything together and they look healthy. Um, you can see that organism is sort of doing well. And then if you see them, I don't know, disheveled and upset and starving, clearly they're not doing too well. And so you can almost begin your ethical examination there, and expand out. But that's not really to do with monism in my mind. That's a certain moral, a teaching of morality that came later in the tradition, and I would look more to other thinkers for that. But the other way that it affects my life in terms of the broader ideas, I think that Eleatic teachings actually become a great sense of, like, sort of a great source of relief and confidence in things, because you're never going to lose anything. Um, you know, nothing ever truly goes away. It all exists, and there is no alternative to existence. So there's no way something could be destroyed, because what way could it be other than to exist? Because nothing is an incoherent concept. You can't point to it. You can't say that thing became nothing, because nothing is, it's not a coherent concept. There's nothing to, and the process of becoming doesn't make any sense here. So the in a way, it's a great relief. Whatever you think you might have lost or is behind you, it's still there. And there's a line in Aristotle that I used to interpret in an Eleatic way, and it's not the way he intended, but he says, given sufficient time, whatever is possible will occur, right? Whatever is possible is necessary, because given sufficient change, eventually, whatever event it is, it will happen. It just has to have enough change. Now, Aristotle, I believe today, is a presentist. So this was one of those. This was a time when I had multiple viewpoints that were in contradiction, and I was trying to interpret him in certain ways to make him more Eleatic than he was. But fundamentally, I do believe that given sufficient time, or in the whole, in the long run, in the grand total of all things that will happen, all that is, everything that is possible is necessary. And so, I also feel that we don't really miss out on any opportunities. We might not have those events or opportunities succeed right now, but in the long run, they will. I don't think we miss out on anything. I don't think we'll lose anything. Um, and I don't think we can ever really die either. I mean, obviously, to an extent, we are our story, right? We are the events that we undergo to some extent, but the we aren't the events that we don't undergo. I mean, what happens to me when I die? Well, I'm not where I'm not. I am where I am. So I don't have to worry about, you know, I see myself as permanently existing, and I don't really think anything too terrible can happen because I know that I'll always be here in some position. And so it's in a way it's a great source of confidence. You know that your existence is inviolate, and you have a certain baseline where you can't be destroyed. And you know that if things don't go well, eventually they will go well because in the long run, everything that's possible will occur. And yeah, that means a whole bunch of bad things will happen, but it also means that all the good potentials will also be experienced. And whatever you lost, it's still there waiting for you when you come back. So, I think when you know that everything exists and nothing's going to be destroyed, it's a great sense of relief and confidence. And also, um, it also does away with certain other teachings like heaven and hell, for example. I mean, there cannot be any permanent state of suffering because no particular moment in your life is privileged over any other moment. There's no way to make a permanent moment because all the other moments exist and are just as much moments as every other moment. And same for heaven, I suppose. There's no permanent state of bliss, but obviously we have our directions and our will towards things that we like or that fulfill us or work to our excellence. But yeah, I think you don't have to worry about eternal damnation anymore. You don't have to worry about being destroyed and failing because any failure is just limited, just like any success is limited. And you know that you'll, even if you don't succeed in an opportunity today, you'll eventually succeed if it was possible. And in the end, you'll know all things about yourself. So I think it's good. I like it.
Yeah. I think that's actually really beautiful and kind of calming because I think that's something that a lot of people really fear about and struggle with, right? The idea of what happens when we die. Do we stop existing? Do we get forgotten? I think that's, in a sense, a really beautiful answer, which I don't know. I really actually quite like that. So I guess my sort of final question for you would be if someone's interested in this and wants to learn more, what should they be reading? What should they be looking at? Where should they go after this to learn a bit more?
Well, the I would say that the best introduction to Parmenides, who is the most famous and popular thinker for the Eleatics, is the Phoenix Pre-socratics. Phoenix, like the bird that is, you light it on fire and it comes back to life for however many years. The Phoenix Pre-socratics. So if you go to Amazon or some other bookstore somewhere, or go into, Barnes and Nobles doesn't really have good books anymore, but if you look up the Phoenix Pre-socratics, or even go to LibGen or somewhere, I guess they took down the other site, and download that. It's a very short book. I think the page, maybe it's like 80 pages or so, but there's a very good introduction that's very accessible. I liked the introduction. Maybe I had a little disagreement with the last chapter of it, but very clear, easy to follow. You don't need a lot of prior knowledge, and then it has all the fragments and the most famous sections of the poem because he wrote a poem, right? The most famous sections of the poem they offer multiple different translations. So if it gives you a few different readings where people are arguing about different perspectives on it. And so I felt it was sort of the perfect book for anyone who wants to be a newcomer to it because it's short, very clear introduction, and it has all of the fragments. And then after that, I would just say go look up Melissus, go look up Xena. And if you're like choose your own adventure books, go to my site, I guess. I have a choose your own adventure book version.
That's really cool. I guess that's most of what I wanted to discuss. Where can people find you? You've mentioned your site. What is your site? What's your socials? Where do you exist? I guess you are
I,
existing as Monism, but where do you exist in the digital hellscape?
right. My particular location in being. So my website is antiquitystudio.com. No spaces or anything. And all it is, it's like, if you remember being in high school and the like, or primary school really, or elementary school, I suppose they call it here. You have choose your own adventure books. I tried to make a very accessible Eleatic philosophy choose your own adventure book. So you visit a temple and you wander around and you can explore and discuss the ideas and stuff in choose your own adventure book format, both as a website and as a PDF. That's at antiquitystudio.com. And then people can find me on Twitter at Tweetophon, and then a website called rpgcodex.com. If anyone's a gamer here, I made an amateur project. If people like Theseus, I made an amateur game project. You can get it on Steam. It's a Theseus and the Journey to Athens, using a lot of primary source material, just tells the myth of Theseus. And if you're an old RPG gamer, like the old school PC games, definitely come over to RPG Codex. Before Twitter was around, everyone was on forums, right? And that's one forum that I've hung around because it's a very large and active community. And I still, people like movies or music and the like. I like old school computer role playing games. So I'm still on that forum and still chat about them.
I think that's really cool. I'm your host, Georgina Rose. I'm on every platform under the sun. I'm literally on all of them. I'm on this podcast, obviously. I make a YouTube channel. That's my big thing. Also on Twitter, TikTok, Telegram, Instagram, all places. And if you want to support this show to enable me to keep having people on, keep doing this, keep the lights on, you can get all the episodes early. You get a pre-show every episode, which is just a solo podcast by me, and you get a number of cool stuff. And the most important thing is if you're a high enough tier, I will read your name out every week. If you opt in, you can always opt out if you want privacy. I understand that. But for those who are willing, thank you so much to Mary, Ruben, Trevino, Shiraz, Emil, Neva, Emily, Lilith, Saranda, Jonah, Nauseated, and Lee. Your continued support means the world. Thank you for enabling me. This has been the Postmodern Iconoclast, and I will see you in the next one. If you're listening on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell. And if you're listening on other podcasting platforms, give us a review. Unless it's a negative review, and then do not give us a review and just listen. All right. See you guys in 2 weeks. All right.